In this lecture, we will learn how to use your database sequences in a plsql code. Let's remember why we use sequences first. We generally need auto-increment values for our new data. For example, we have an employees table in our schema and it has an employee ID column, as we know. This column has increasing number values. Actually, if you look at that table, these values are not created with a sequence, but in a real world job, you will definitely need to do that with a sequence and for most of the times. Because the value is not important. I just want that to be unique. I will use sequence value for an ID or a unique value. Where to use sequences? So some other databases do that with another way, but Oracle does that with sequences. But especially before 11G, we cannot use sequences directly. Now we can use that as default values while creating our table. I explained how to do that in my SQL course. You can check sequences from there to remember. But in real world, we generally do that with plsql triggers. In this lecture, we will learn how to use a sequence in a plsql code. An important thing about sequences is a sequence is independent from a table. That means you can use a sequence with more than one table. I don't recommend you to do that, but you can use if you need. Besides, in each call of next value, a sequence increases one value. Either you use it or not. So don't call it if you don't really need it. Otherwise, you will break the chain of incremented numbers. I mean, when a row's value is 30, the next value will be 34 even if you need 31. If you want to guarantee that, you can use maximum value plus 1, or you can make some privileges to use that, so that no one can call it except your user. So how to use sequences? With 11G and 12C, we can use nextval and curval pseudocolumns in our plsql code. We can assign a sequence value into a database column or a plsql variable. But the value or column that we assign our sequence must be a number type. We can use sequences with two ways. The first way is using our sequence in a select query. Before 11G, you have to do like that. There is no other option in the previous releases. So how do we do that? We write our sequence name between select and into keywords. We specify whether we use next value or current value of our sequence with using sequence name dot nextval or sequence name dot curval. And after into keyword, we write our variable or column name. But don't let column name to confuse you. This is not a single column name. In triggers, you will reach to the column names with old and new keywords. So you will use these column names in triggers. You will see how to do that in triggers lecture. So just focus on the variables for now. After the from keyword, you need to use a table name. If your table name returns only one row, no problem. If it returns more than one row, you will have an error. But you can handle this with writing a where clause and make the code return only one value. Instead of using a different table, you can use the dual table. Since dual table returns only one row, your sequence will run without any errors. In a real work, we generally use dual table. I suggest you to do that too. We will make examples about that. But with 11G and later, you can use a sequence directly on assignment. We simply write our variable name or our column name if we use that in a trigger and assign that with our sequence value. This will also generate the next or current value of our sequences. Now, let's open up the SQL developer and make some examples. First, let's drop and recreate our employees copy table. Now, let's create a very simple sequence first. Create sequence, let's say employee ID sequence and start with 207. I started with 207 because our last employee ID is 206. So I want that to start with the next value. And increment by 1. I just wanted to increment 1 by 1. You can assign a different value if you wish. Now let's create it. Great. We created our sequence. Now let's add 10 new rows with using the insert example in our previous lecture. I just pasted that into the next worksheet. So let's close this. Let's update this code then. Now let's change the for loop first because it's enough to run for 10 times. No need to start from the next value of our employee number in here. I will do that with our sequence. So I just write 1 ... 10. And in here we will write employee ID dot next val instead of our variable I. Employee ID sequence. This is our sequence name dot next value. And I will copy that and paste that for here too. Now let's run it. Let's clear here first. We don't need that. And let's run it. Great. Now let's check if we could insert. Sorry. As we can see, we inserted our new employees with using our sequence. One important point in here. Even if we call the next val 2 times in one insert, it increased the value for in 1 time. But the next row has one next value. That means the increment is occurred in different statements. In the same statement, our sequence will increase only for once, even we call it more than 1 times. Just be careful about that. Now, let's use our sequence with variables. Let's start with the old way. Let's open up the server output on first. Now let's delete here and write another code. Declare. Now let's create our number to keep the value of our sequence. V sequence number, and it's a number. And begin. Now let's write our select int clause. Select employee ID sequence dot next value into our variable name. From our dual table. And print the value of our variable. Now let's run it. We have some typos. Let's clear up and run again. And another typo here. As we can see, we succeeded. We can use this variable in anywhere of our code anymore. Now, let's change our table name with employees copy and run the code again. Let's clear up and run. As we can see, we had an error. Exact fetch returns more than one value. This is not about the sequence. This is about the int clause. Your result cannot return more than one value when you use the int clause. Now, let's add a var clause then. Where raw num is equal to 1. Let's clear up and run again. Perfect. Now, let me show you the new way of using a sequence. As we learned now, we can use a sequence individually with starting 11G release. I mean, we can either assign it directly or even we can use it inside of our DBMS output. Now let's update our code then. Let me copy that again. Is equal to dot next file. Let me delete these. And our var clause. Perfect. Let's clear up and run. As we can see, no problem. We can directly assign it into a variable. Now, let's delete the assignment and try to output the next value of our sequence. Let me copy that and let's comment this and paste that into here. Let's run that. As we can see, no problem. We can use that individually. Let's run for several times. We have a new value in each run. Now, let's change the next val with the curve val and run for several times again. With this way, we have the same value in every run. You already know that in your SQL lessons. Perfect. We know how to use a sequence inside of our plsql code now. So this is the end of this lecture. See you in the next lessons.